Good evening and welcome. I'm your host Ben, and tonight we step back into 18th century England, not to grand estates or bustling courts, but into a humble workshop where a single craftsman turns hides into shoes. We'll follow each careful cut, every waxed stitch, and the gentle rhythm of hand tools shaping leather around wooden lasts. No hurry, no fanfare, just the quiet, watchful craft of shoemaking as dawn light spills over the bench. Tools clink softly, and a new pair of shoes comes to life. But first, thank you so much for your support. If you genuinely love this journey through history, please like and subscribe to stay with us for more calm explorations. Now, settle in, breathe easy, and let's begin. You wake early, breath misting in the chill of dawn. The workshop is still dim and cold, smelling faintly of leather and yesterday's smoke. Stooping by the hearth, you coax a small fire to life with last night's embers. As orange light fills the little room, it dances over racks of wooden footmolds, lasts, lined up on a shelf. Each last bears a scrawled name or initial of a customer. Wealthier families even pay you to keep a custom wooden model for each of their feet. These smooth, foot-shaped blocks of wood are the foundation of your craft, the shapes over which every shoe is formed. You run a calloused hand over one particularly worn last, recalling the many pairs of shoes you've built upon it. Outside on the quiet street, a lone rooster crows and a market cart rattles in the distance. But inside your workshop it is peaceful, the day not yet begun. You shrug on your apron, a stiff, waxy leather apron that has softened to your shape over the years, and settle onto your low stool. In the corner lies your shoemaker's bench, a sturdy wooden seat with built-in storage, its surface scarred by knife cuts and darkened by polish and sweat. You like to work close to the window for light, so you carry a few essential tools over to the sunlit work table. There is comfort in this morning ritual. The tools of your trade are simple and familiar. A straight-bladed knife for cutting soles, a smaller curved knife for trimming, a set of awls, pointed irons for punching holes, and your hammer and pincers. Each tool has a place. On a nearby peg hangs a bundle of waxed linen threads with bristles attached, your homemade needles, since boar's bristles are often used instead of metal needles to sew tough leather. A crock on the bench holds lumps of sticky shoemaker's wax, a mixture of pine resin, beeswax and oil, warming slightly by the hearth. You'll draw your linen threads through that wax to strengthen and waterproof them. The warm, sharp smell of pine pitch and beeswax joins the leathery aroma in the air, a scent as much a part of your workshop as the wood shavings on the floor. An 18th century painting of a shoemaker at work in a simple village workshop. A cat naps atop the wooden workbench as the shoemaker and a visitor chat, reflecting the humble and communal atmosphere of the trade. By now the fire is crackling gently, taking the edge off the cold. In the growing light, you inspect a side of leather hanging on the wall. It's good cowhide, delivered by the tanner last week, thick bend leather for soles and a suppler hide for uppers. You run your fingers over its surface, feeling the slight grease from the tanner's finish. Tanning is a foul, arduous business, one you're just as happy to let others handle, but it produces the durable hides you need for shoes. This particular hide is a warm brown and smells earthy with hints of tannin. You decide it will serve well for a pair of stout men's shoes that you must finish by week's end. First, however, you have an order due today, a pair of everyday shoes for a local farmer. Those await only final polishing and laces. You set them near the hearth to warm and soften the leather for a shine later. The farmer himself arrives just as the morning sun slants in. He stomps off mud at the door, doffs his hat, and greets you with a gap-toothed grin. He's come early, eager for his new shoes. Many of your customers are up with the dawn, their work governed by the sun. You retrieve his finished shoes, sturdy low shoes, made of thick cowhide, with plain brass buckles, and help him try them on. He presses his foot in, and settles it back on the heel. There is no left or right distinction in these shoes. Like almost all footwear of this era, they were made on straight lasts, and will gradually shape to each foot with wear. The farmer takes a few steps within your cramped front room, feeling the fit. The leather creaks, you watch his face. A satisfied smile tells you all you need to know. They feel grand, he says softly. You nod and remind him to switch them between feet now and then, so they break in evenly, a common practice since the shoes are identical in shape. He chuckles, pays you with a handful of coins, hard-earned money for him. A good pair of shoes costs roughly a day's wages for a laborer, and promises to return next season for repairs if needed. Soon he is on his way, the sound of his new soles scuffing the dirt road outside as he departs. With your first customer seen to, you turn back to your bench to begin the day's main work, making a fresh pair of shoes from scratch. The order on your ledger is for a town merchant who stopped in 2 days ago. You remember measuring his feet. He stood on a sheet of parchment while you traced the outline of each foot with a charcoal nub. You also took a tape to measure around his instep and heel. His feet were of average size, but one slightly wider than the other, as is often the case. You have his foot tracings tacked up above the bench, ready to guide your cutting. Beside them you've selected a wooden last from your rack that best matches his measurements. It's not exactly perfect, 1 or 2 areas need adjustment, so you plan to modify it. Taking a small knife and rasp, you shave down a spot near the little toe and nail on a thin leather pad at the instep to widen it, tailoring the last to replicate the contours of his feet. This way, even though the shoes will be straight-lasted, identical shape for both feet, they'll fit his particular feet more closely once broken in. Satisfied with the last shape, you set it aside and prepare to cut the leather, crafting the shoes from measurement to stitching. Now the real craft begins. You work systematically, following a sequence of time-honored steps that turn raw leather into a finished shoe. Over years of practice, these steps have become almost second nature, a day's rhythm that you could perform in your sleep. Indeed, you sometimes dream of stitching. Still, you carry them out with care and precision, knowing that a mistake in any stage can mean discomfort or wasted materials. Shoemaking in the 18th century is still entirely done by hand, often by a small team or even a lone artisan like yourself. In larger workshops, different specialists might handle various tasks, one to cut leather, another, called a closer, to sew uppers, and others to assemble the shoe. But in your modest shop you perform every step yourself, occasionally with a helping hand from an apprentice. Today it's just you and your tools, and a full day of work lies ahead. You mentally run through the process to come, a comforting checklist that frames the journey from hide to shoe. Basic steps in traditional shoemaking. Cutting. First you cut out the leather pieces for the shoe, the soles, insoles, and the upper parts, the vamp and quarters. Stitching uppers. Next you sew together the upper pieces, joining the vamp to the quarters, to form the shoe's upper shell. Lasting. You then stretch and mold this leather upper onto the wooden last to give it shape, fastening it in place temporarily with tacks or a leather strap. Attaching the sole. Once the upper is secured on the last, you attach the outsole, the bottom leather sole, to the shoe, stitching it or pegging it firmly around the edges. Adding a second sole, welted or double sole. For sturdy shoes, you may add a second sole or a welt, a strip of leather between upper and sole, for extra durability. Heels. If the style requires, you build up and attach the heel. This could be a low stacked leather heel for a man's shoe, or a higher wooden heel covered in leather for a lady's shoe. Finishing. Finally, you finish the shoe by trimming any excess, smoothing the edges, and then blackening, polishing and waxing the leather for protection and shine. This routine is ingrained in you now, but you still remember your early days as an apprentice when it all felt overwhelming. A good shoemaker could make a pair of shoes with only a knife and an awl, your master used to tease. An exaggeration perhaps, but it spoke to the simplicity of tools versus the skill required to use them well. You smile at the thought and get to work on step 1, cutting. On your cutting bench, you unroll the calfskin leather selected for the uppers. It's pliable but strong, ideal for a man's everyday shoe. Using the foot tracings as a guide, you chalk out the shapes of the vamp, the front/top part of the shoe that will cover the toes and instep, and the quarters, the back and sides that wrap the heel. You leave a bit of extra allowance for seams. Wasting leather is costly, so you position each outline carefully to click the patterns with economy. A skillful cutter can nest shapes like a puzzle to use the hide efficiently. Satisfied with the layout, you take up your half-moon knife, a razor-sharp blade with a curved edge, and press it steadily along the chalk lines. The knife glides through the leather with a whispery scrape. With each cut, The pieces of the future shoe separate from the hide. 2 vamps, 1 for each shoe, and 4 quarters, 2 per shoe, for inner and outer sides. You also cut sturdy strips of thicker leather for insoles, and set aside a thick sole leather piece that will be trimmed to shape later. Soon a small pile of leather pieces lies on your bench, and the once whole hide has a jigsaw of holes where the patterns were cut. Seeing the components of the shoe spread out, you appreciate how a few flat pieces will soon become a 3-dimensional piece of footwear, a little everyday marvel of geometry and skill. Now comes stitching the upper. You reach for your bristle and waxed thread. Each length of linen thread has a bristle from a boar twisted onto its end, forming a stiff needle-like point. This lets you push the thread through holes without using an actual metal needle, a traditional technique among cordwainers. You warm a bit of wax between your fingers and rub it along the thread, making it tacky and strong. Taking an upper piece in hand, the vamp, you fold its edge and skive thin the margin where it will overlap the quarters. Using your awl, you punch a series of small holes along these edges, each hole spaced evenly by eye and feel. The awl's tip is fine and diamond-shaped, piercing the leather with a controlled twist of your wrist. You then align a quarter piece to the vamp, holes matching up, and begin to sew. With a bristle on each end of a long waxed thread, a 2-needle method, you perform a saddle stitch, passing one end through a hole from one side, and the other end from the opposite side, crossing inside the hole and pulling tight. Each stitch locks the thread in the leather. Drawn by your firm pull, the waxed threads cinch the seam tightly and seal it against moisture. A rhythmic motion develops. Poke the awl to enlarge the next hole. Pass bristle A through, then bristle B. Pull both ends taut with a comforting scritch of waxed thread. You keep your fingers clear of the path. The threads can cut like garrote when yanked tight. And indeed you wear a few leather strips like thimbles on your fingers, called hand leeches or finger stalls, to protect against the bite of the thread. The upper comes together piece by piece. Soon both shoes' uppers are fully stitched, each now looking more or less like a leather sock or slipper, open at the front where the tongue will be, and at the top where the foot enters. Before moving on, you punch a few holes or slits for whatever fastening the design calls for. The merchant requested simple lace ties instead of buckles, perhaps a modest preference or simply practicality. So you make 2 small pairs of eyelet holes along each quarter for laces to pass through. If buckles were to be used, you would sew on straps and leave slots for buckle tongues instead. In another commission, maybe for a gentleman's fine shoe, you might attach polished metal buckles, since buckles are quite the fashion these days for men's shoes. But buckles are often provided by the customer or a specialist metal worker. Your job is to accommodate them. For women's shoes, laces or ribbon ties are common, and sometimes the uppers are made of fancy silk or brocade. In fact, many women's shoes of the 1700s are made of textiles like satin, with only the sole and heel of leather. By contrast, men's shoes are usually all leather, sturdier and plainer for daily wear. As you work, you reflect on these differences, already planning how you'll adjust your technique for the next pair if it's for a lady. Lighter linen thread perhaps, finer stitches on delicate fabric. Each pair of shoes is a custom project, and you quietly take pride in tailoring your craft to the wearer. With the uppers stitched and shaped, you prepare for the lasting process. This is where those floppy leather uppers take on the form of a foot. You insert the wooden last into the first upper, making sure it sits correctly at the toe. The last looks a bit like a foot with no toes, since in many lasts the tip is pointed or rounded to shape the shoe's front. If this were a lady's fashion shoe, the last might even have her exaggerated point called a toe pin to form a stylish narrow tip. But for this man's shoe, the last has a sensible round toe. You draw the upper tight around the last, starting at the toe and then the heel. Leather has a grain and a give. You've kept it slightly damp to help it stretch. Using an iron tool called a lasting pincer, you grip the leather and tug it firmly down over the bottom of the last. Creak, pop. The tension sounds as tiny wrinkles smooth out. You tuck the excess leather of the upper underneath the last, where it will later be attached to the sole. For now, you secure the leather in place with a few short lasting tacks, nails driven through the bottom into the last, or sometimes with a long leather strap called a stirrup that you loop over the top of the last, under the bench, and around your knee, literally strapping the work down tightly. On your wall, a coil of worn leather belting attests to years of using such a stirrup to hold shoes while you sew. Ensuring the upper is centered and even, you proceed around the foot, pulling and tacking until the leather upper is molded snugly to the last's shape. This step takes strength and finesse. The leather resists in some places and must be persuaded without tearing. You feel the strain in your arms as you work the material. Little by little, an upper that once was flat now hugs the curves of a foot form. Where there were awkward puckers, you make tiny pleats at the insole that will later be covered by the sole. In a finer shoe or a turn shoe construction, you'd be careful to keep any puckers minimal. In a heavy working shoe, a few folds inside won't matter for comfort. Finally, the shape is set. The ghost of a shoe, upper stretched on a foot-like form, is ready to meet its sole. The workshop's midday pause. By late morning, you've made good progress. One shoe upper is lasted and awaiting its sole. You set it aside and begin lasting the second shoe. As you repeat the process, your mind wanders pleasantly. This kind of handwork, though hard on the back and hands, can be meditative. You think about the people who will wear these shoes and the countless others you've shod over the years. There is a quiet dignity in knowing that from the lowliest farmer to the high society nobleman, everyone needs shoes. Everyone relies on craftsmen like you to walk comfortably through life. Your profession, humble as it may seem, is firmly woven into the community. In fact, the shoemaker is regarded as an integral tradesman in town. Unlike some artisans who cater only to the wealthy, you see customers of every class. This morning alone you served a farmer. This afternoon you craft for a merchant. Next week perhaps a wealthy landowner's order will come. All eventually find their way to your door because feet always need covering. In an era when a person might wear out several pairs of shoes a year from all the walking on rough roads, the demand for your trade never wanes. Wiping your brow, you pause to stoke the fire and put on a kettle. It's midday now. Sunlight falls through the window in a golden beam, illuminating motes of dust and highlighting the well-worn tools on your bench. You allow yourself a short break, a hunk of bread and cheese from a small cupboard, and a cup of small beer or weak ale, the common refreshment for craftsmen. As you sit on your stool and nibble your meal, you listen to the sounds of the street outside, which have grown lively. Through the open half-door of your shop, you hear a fruit seller calling her wares, children chasing each other with gleeful shouts, and the clop of a horse pulling a carriage over the cobbles. The clip-clop momentarily grows louder as the carriage passes your shop. You imagine the well-dressed gentleman inside, perhaps wearing fashionable buckled shoes with shiny black leather, the kind only the wealthy can afford. Maybe those shoes were made by a cordwainer in London, or by one of your colleagues here in town. You can't help but feel a bit of pride. Whether simple or luxurious, shoes are the product of your brethren in the craft. Every step those fine gentlemen take still depends on the skill of a shoemaker. Your apprentice, a lanky boy of about 14, returns from his errand running and joins you quietly, biting into an apple. He has been with you a year, learning the basics, how to cut patterns from scrap leather, how to wax a thread, how to stitch straighter and tighter each day. In time, he will tackle lasting and soling. But for now you mostly trust him with simpler tasks. As he munches, his eyes drift to the half-finished shoes on the bench. Sensing his curiosity, you hand him one of the lasted uppers to examine. Not so rough on the leather, you gently remind as he pokes at the tacked underside. He asks a few questions. Why this leather? Why those small folds near the toe? And you explain, in the patient way your own master once did for you. Teaching him reminds you of your own apprenticeship years ago, when you were the one peering over a master's shoulder. The tools and materials were inexpensive enough, compared to other trades, that once you finished training, setting up shop wasn't an impossible dream. You saved up, bought some good leather, and a basic kit of tools, and struck out as a journeyman, eventually establishing this very workshop. Many tradesmen cannot easily afford to go independent. A blacksmith needs a whole forge and anvil. A printer needs a costly press. But a shoemaker's kit, awls, knives, hammers, and a lapstone, is modest. It's skill, reputation, and a loyal customer base that make a shoemaker's business more than fancy equipment. As you resume work, you chat amiably with the apprentice. He mentions that his cousin, a tailor's apprentice, claims tailoring is a more genteel trade. You chuckle and shake your head. While it's true tailors often serve high fashion and sometimes enjoy higher social status, you know that shoemakers, or cordwainers to use the traditional term, have their own proud heritage. In fact, you recall with a grin the old saying that one must never call a shoemaker a cobbler. A cobbler, in the language of craftsmen, is just a fixer of old shoes, a bungling workman or botcher who isn't trained to make new footwear. Historically, cordwainers and cobblers were separate and sometimes at odds. Cobblers were forbidden by guild rules from making new shoes, only allowed to repair, and had a reputation for shoddy, makeshift work. In London and other cities, the cordwainers' guilds even enforced laws to prevent cobblers from competing with true shoemakers. You explain to your apprentice that while you don't look down on anyone trying to make a living, you take pride in being a maker of footwear, not just a mender. Your apprentice nods, having heard the distinction before. He certainly won't be calling you a cobbler anytime soon. In the eyes of the community, a skilled shoemaker like you is a respectable tradesman, a small business owner providing an essential service. You've seen prosperous times when demand was high, and lean times when leather was scarce or war-disrupted trade, but through it all, people need shoes. In fact, during wars, bootmakers are in high demand supplying soldiers. You might not be a rich man, but you hold your head up. Your craft is honest, time-honored, and even acknowledged by patron saints. Saint Crispin and Saint Crispinian, the law goes, were martyrs who made shoes in the evenings. Every October 25th on Saint Crispin's Day, fellow shoemakers raise a quiet toast to them. As you finish your simple lunch, you reflect on how shoemaking fits into the wider economy of the town and country. On the shelf by the wall is a ledger where you track orders. Flipping through, you see a variety of entries. Common shop work, repairs and ready-made shoes for townsfolk of moderate means. The occasional bespoke order, a custom pair for a wealthy client which fetches a high price but demands top-quality effort, and even market work, cheaper shoes sold in the public market for those with very little to spend. There is also mention of order work, a dozen pairs of rough shoes you made last spring for a merchant who shipped them to the colonies. In recent decades, some enterprising master shoemakers have begun coordinating larger operations. They farm out parts of the shoemaking process to journeymen working at home, then assemble the pieces in a central shop. Workshops are growing larger, almost like small factories with many hands dividing the labor, especially in big cities. But here in your town, things are still on a personable scale. You know your clients by name, and when a pair of shoes leaves your bench, you've touched every stitch of it. It's satisfying, in a quiet way, to maintain that personal craftsmanship, even as the world around you begins to experiment with mass production. Your apprentice asks carefully, "Master, do you think I'll be ready to make a whole pair on my own soon?" You look at him, earnest, a bit anxious, and give an encouraging smile. In time, you assure, perhaps you'll start him on a pair of child's shoes or some simpler task next month. Many a family in town trains a son in the shoemaking art so they can have reliable shoes with little cost. It's a skill that finds use everywhere. And who knows, maybe one day your apprentice will take over this shop or open his own. Thus the tradition continues. The clock, a small mantel clock you traded repair work for, chimes the early afternoon hour. Break time is over. You and the boy return to your tasks. With a swig of ale and a final bite of bread, you feel refreshed. Outside, the noises of midday begin to ebb as people retreat from the noonday sun. You dip a rag in water and wipe your hands, flexing your fingers. They're a bit sore from the morning stitching, but nothing a craftsman's calluses can't handle. It's time to attach the soles and truly make these shoes ready for walking. Afternoon, soles, heels, and finishing touches. Back at your bench, you take up one of the lasted shoes. Now a leather upper, tightly conformed to the wooden last, with the bottom open and ready. This step, attaching the sole, will truly marry form and function. For a sturdy everyday shoe like this, you'll perform a process akin to the English welted construction, though done entirely by hand, of course. First, you cut out an insole from a bend of thick but flexible leather. The insole is fitted onto the bottom of the lasted upper, providing a foundation to which everything will be secured. Using an awl, you perforate around the edge of the insole and sew it to the bottom edges of the upper leather that are wrapped under the last. This forms what's called the welt, effectively a seam running around the perimeter, joining upper and insole. It's painstaking work. You make all holes through the tough insole and the folded upper leather, then pass heavy waxed thread through in a tight saddle stitch. Each time the awl punches through, you feel the jolt in your palm. Each time you draw the thread taut, you hear a satisfying squeak. Slowly, stitch by stitch, the upper is firmly attached to the insole around the whole circumference. The world narrows to you, the shoe in your lap, and the needle and awl in motion. Your apprentice watches intently as you explain the importance of spacing the stitches evenly and pulling each one snug. This welt stitch is critical. It's what keeps the shoe from coming apart during miles of walking. The threads, coated in tarry wax, will also resist rot and moisture, helping the shoes endure mud and rain. With the welt in place, you trim any extra flap of leather. Now you have a bottom that is ready to receive the outsole, the thick piece of sole leather that will meet the ground. You've already cut a sole roughly to shape earlier. You soak it lightly to make it more pliable. Sole leather can be very stiff when dry. Placing the damp sole leather against the bottom, you mark where it overlaps the welt seam. If this were a simpler shoe or a cheap pair, you might at this point simply nail on the sole with short iron hobnails or wooden pegs. Pegged construction is faster, and many country shoes or military boots are made by driving a row of stout nails through the soles. The nail heads on the walking surface even act as hobnails to reduce wear. Indeed, some of your own older pairs of work boots have a constellation of nail heads on their soles. However, for this client's shoes, you choose the finer method. You will sew the sole on. It's the hallmark of quality in your trade. A well-sewn sole can hold up and also be replaced later when it wears thin. You prepare a length of braided hemp cord, thick as a small worm, and coat it thoroughly with your sticky shoemaker's wax. This will be your sole thread. Using a curved awl this time, it has a gentle bend to reach into the seam. You begin punching through the sole and into the welt from the bottom, carefully angling so you emerge in the channel of the welt seam you made. For each puncture, you push through a bristled cord end, and then its partner from the opposite side, performing another robust saddle stitch that locks the sole to the welt. This is heavy sewing, literally stitching the shoe together. You grunt softly with effort as you pull the thick cord through hole after hole. The apprentice stands by to hand you tools or hold the shoe steady when needed. As you go, you trim excess sole leather with your knife to ensure it matches the outline of the shoe. Eventually, the sole is completely sewn on, sitting tight and flush with the upper. You feel the result with your fingers, a smooth join, no gaps. Already the object in your hands has weight and substance. It feels like a proper shoe now, solid and ready to bear its wearer. Next comes the heel. In the 18th century, heels on men's shoes are typically low, around an inch or less, and made by stacking layers of leather, called lifts, which are nailed together. Women's shoes, by contrast, often have higher heels that are carved from wood and then covered in leather. Since you are making men's shoes, you'll create a modest stacked leather heel. You cut several small pieces of thick leather, each shaped like the heel area. One by one, you cement using a bit of pine pitch glue, and then nail these lifts onto the rear of the sole, building up the heel. You use short brass nails, driving them in a circular pattern so they won't hit the area where the foot rests. Boot making is considered a prestigious specialty in your trade. Riding boots can have taller heels and require their own expertise, but for common shoes like these, the process is straightforward. Tap, tap, tap. Your hammer's blows sound sturdy but not loud in the quiet afternoon. The apprentice holds the shoe steady on the iron last stand, essentially a metal foot-shaped anvil, while you secure the heel layers. Once they are stacked to about 3/4 of an inch, you bevel the sides, slicing away slight angles so the heel isn't a raw block. If the customer wanted high heels for fashion, as some gentlemen following French court trends do, with their heels dyed red perhaps, you could accommodate, but generally your clients prefer practicality. As you work, you think of the variety of footwear you and your fellow shoemakers produce in this era. There are sturdy boots for riding and hunting, tall shafts of leather reaching the knee which you rarely make except on special order. There are moccasins and simple shoes worn by frontier folk, even some slippers and clogs. You've heard the term tennis shoes mentioned by some French travelers, specialized flat shoes for playing court tennis in high society, and of course delicate dancing pumps for ballroom revels, made of the softest kid leather or silk, with smooth soles for gliding on polished floors. In your shop window, a modest glass-paneled hutch you open during the day, you even have a few ready-made shoes on display, a pair of child's ankle boots in stout leather, a couple of common women's shoes in popular sizes, and one showpiece pair of ladies' embroidered silk shoes, which you made in hopes of attracting some genteel business. These hang solitarily, gathering a bit of dust. Most of your income comes from made-to-order everyday footwear, not extravagant pieces. Still, it's good to showcase the range of what you can do. Many passers-by have paused to marvel at the tiny stitches on those silk shoes, or the brightness of their blue ribbon ties. By mid-afternoon, both shoes now have their soles attached and heels built. You remove the small tacks that held the uppers during lasting, as the stitching and nails now hold everything in place. With a few light taps, you ease the wooden lasts out of the finished shoes. This moment never gets old. Out pops the last, and what remains in your hands looks alive, a fully formed shoe, holding its shape on its own. You check inside with your fingertips, smooth, with no stray nails protruding. That's a mark of a careless cobbler, not you. The insole lies flat, and the interior seams are all covered or pressed flat. so as not to rub the wearer's foot too harshly. The shoes are essentially complete in structure, but they don't look finished yet. The leather is a bit dull, and still bears pencil marks and scuffs from handling. The edges of the soles are rough where you trimmed them. Now comes the finishing, the final beautification and protection step. You take a sharp knife, a tranche or a fleshing knife, and carefully trim the edges of the soles and heels, evening them up with the uppers. Then, with a wood rasp and a piece of coarse sandpaper, glass paper, you smooth those edges. Next, you use a tool called a bone folder or slicker, often literally a piece of polished bone or hard wood, to burnish the leather. Rubbing briskly along the sole edges, you generate heat and compression that darkens and shines the leather, giving it a sealed look. The sole edges, once pale and fibrous, turn a burnished brown-black, sleek to the touch. For the uppers, you take a small polishing stick and a rag, but first you apply blacking and wax. From a jar you scoop a mixture of tallow, beeswax and lamp black soot, your homemade polish. In the colonies, some use exotic additions like bear grease in this mixture, but you make do with mutton fat or lard mixed with beeswax and a bit of charcoal for color. You recall reading an advertisement that the first commercial shoe polish was only recently introduced in the 1770s. But most folks still rely on traditional concoctions like yours. Rubbing a dab of this blacking onto the leather, you then work it in with the cloth using brisk, firm strokes. The apprentice joins, buffing the other shoe. Slowly, a soft luster emerges on the leather surface. You can see your distorted reflection in the toe, the satisfaction of a deep brown shine that will also help repel water. A whiff of the polish reaches your nose. A mix of smoky soot and sweet beeswax, not unpleasant, and certainly familiar. Finally, you set the shoes near the hearth for a short while, letting the warmth help the wax penetrate and set. The glow of the firelight on the freshly polished leather makes them gleam. Finishing also includes any decoration. These shoes are plain, but if they were for a finer client, you might have added pinking, decorative perforations, or perhaps the customer's initials discreetly inside. For ladies, sometimes you paste a soft paper label of your shop inside the shoe. But this customer knows you well, and a label seems unnecessary. Your mark is in every stitch. As a last touch, you cut a length of sturdy latchet lace. Earlier you punched the eyelet holes. Now you thread through a fresh leather lace in each shoe, crisscrossing it and leaving it untied. They'll likely replace it with a colored ribbon, or a longer lace if they prefer. But you deliver the shoes ready to wear, straight out of the shop. You straighten up from your workbench and arch your back, feeling the satisfying ache of a day's labor. The apprentice quietly tidies scraps of leather and sweeps the floor around your bench, one of his daily duties. Leather offcuts pile up, the larger ones you'll save, perhaps to make small leather goods or patching. The truly tiny bits will go into the cobbler's barrel to be discarded or recycled. It's astounding how every pair of shoes generates a handful of little curlicues of leather and thread clippings that end up underfoot. A quick sweep keeps the workshop from becoming a total shambles. Holding up the finished pair to the light, you regard them with practiced eyes. Sturdy, well-balanced, handsome in their simple way. These are shoes meant to pound the cobbles and carry their owner comfortably through the day. They've got a decent shine, but not so mirror-bright as to be gaudy. The toe shape is neither too pointed nor too square, a moderate round toe that's in fashion for men's shoes at present. You check the size by comparing them to the wooden last and the foot tracings. They match perfectly. Soon the merchant who ordered them will arrive to try them on. There is always a slight worry. Will they pinch? Were the measurements accurate? But you are fairly confident. You've made shoes for him before. As insurance, you've built the shoes to be a touch roomy, knowing you can add an extra insole or he can wear thicker stockings if needed. People in this time often wear 1 or 2 pairs of knitted stockings, and sometimes stuff a bit of wool at the toes if a shoe is loose. Better a tad loose than too tight, since leather can always be padded or gradually tightened by wetting and drying, but it's harder to remedy a shoe that is too small except by painful stretching. Just as you predicted, in walks the customer, the merchant, in late afternoon, during a lull in his own business. You greet him and offer him a seat. With a flourish, you present the new shoes. He admires them, turning them in his hands, checking the sole sewing. Many clients have a habit of inspecting the bottom to see the neat row of stitches or nails, a bit of amateur appraisal of quality. He seems pleased. Removing his worn older shoes, which you notice could use a resoling soon, he pulls on the new ones. They slide in without fuss. He stands, walks a few steps, wiggles his toes. A broad smile on his face tells you all you need to know. Snug at the heel, just as I like, and good room at the toes, he notes. You nod, explaining that the leather will soften and mold further with wear. He remarks on the shine and you modestly credit a fresh batch of polish. After a couple minutes of pacing in them, a slight squeak of new leather audible, he declares them excellent. The apprentice fetches a small mirror and places it on the floor so the client can see how the shoes look on his feet. The merchant chuckles at the gesture, but does glance. Appearance matters, even for practical shoes. Satisfied, he resumes his old pair, wrinkled and tired looking by comparison, for the walk home, opting to save the new shoes for the morrow when he's not trudging through dusty streets. Before leaving, he inquires if you could also make a pair of lighter indoor slippers for him, and perhaps something for his wife. Certainly, you reply, delighted at the prospect of more work. Business through word of mouth and repeat orders is your lifeblood. He leaves a deposit for the slippers and pays the balance for the shoes, tipping a little extra for your prompt delivery. You thank him kindly and wish him well. As he departs, he adds, I'll be sure to mention your shop to my neighbors. Those shoes look better than the London ones. A bit of flattery perhaps, but it warms you nonetheless. The day's work is largely done. 2 satisfied customers, 1 new order, and a finished pair of shoes drying by the hearth. You allow yourself a moment of rest, sitting back on your bench and closing your eyes. The sounds of late afternoon drift in, distant church bells marking vespers, the clatter of a shutter being closed by a shopkeeper across the street, a horse whinnying as it's led to the stable. Your apprentice quietly asks if he may head home. You nod, he's earned his rest, and typically his workday ends with the sun's fading light. Don't forget to oil the stitching awls and hang them up, you remind him. He goes about the final chores, wiping down the knives and awls to prevent rust. Simple tools they may be, but you care for them. A well-forged awl or knife can last decades if kept clean and sharp. Sweeping the last of the scraps and carefully refilling the oil in the little shoemaker's lamp on the bench. That lamp is a clever device, an oil lamp with a glass globe filled with water that magnifies the light onto your workspace. It helps a great deal in the evenings. He trims the lamp wick and ensures it's ready in case you need it later. You notice he's humming a tune softly, the same tune your master used to hum. It seems the workshop has its own little traditions being passed down. Evening. Closing the shop. As dusk approaches, the pace of life in the street slows. One by one, shop windows are shuttered and doors latched. In your workshop, the natural light dims to a blue haze. You light a single candle and place it on the bench, its flame fluttering and casting long shadows of lasts and tools on the wall. The apprentice has gone home for supper with his family. You are alone in the gentle quiet, finishing the last few tasks of the day. The newly made shoes have cooled and set nicely, so you give them a final buff with a soft rag and place them on a shelf, ready for the customer tomorrow. You tidy the workbench, putting the awls back in their holder and the knives in a small drawer. A few leftover scraps of leather from today's cut are placed in a bin. Perhaps they'll serve for minor repairs or to patch someone's shoe in the future. A long strip of leftover sole leather might become a heel lift for another shoe. Nothing usable is wasted if you can help it. Before closing up, you take a moment to record the day's work in your ledger by candlelight. In careful script, you note the completed order, 1 pair men's shoes, size 8, delivered, and the payment received. You also jot down the new order for slippers, including the customer's name and requested date. The ledger's pages bear testimony to your year. Dozens of entries, some crossed out when fulfilled, some marked paid, and a few sadly marked owed for those who are late on payments. The smell of ink mixes with the leathery aroma of the shop as you write. You sand the wet ink gently and close the book. Another day's entry done. Taking the candle with you, you move around the workshop, performing the familiar dance of closing. You cap the ink bottle, cover the jar of polish to keep it from drying, and double-check that the hearth embers are safely contained. With an iron hook, you settle a lid over the fire, a precaution against stray sparks in the night. The flicker of the remaining embers peeks out from under the lid, a warm heart still glowing faintly. You place a few small off-cut pieces of leather by the hearth where they'll dry out. Tomorrow you'll use them as kindling to start the morning fire anew. Next, you walk to the front door. The evening air seeps in, carrying the distant sound of a lullaby being sung in one of the houses down the lane. Across the way, the tavern lantern is lit, glowing invitingly, A couple of locals linger outside it, discussing the day's news in low voices. You inhale the cool air. It's laced with the smell of hearth smoke from many chimneys and the yeasty aroma of bread from the baker's oven. A few doors down, the baker often bakes into the evening, preparing dough for the morrow. Such domestic, cozy smells remind you that it's nearly time to head upstairs to your own family and supper. You gently close the top half of your shop's Dutch door. You had left it open for air. On the inner side of the door hang a few old shoes, samples, and some lasts dangling, which you leave as is. You slide the wooden bolt to secure the door. There is a small signboard above the door with the emblem of a boot, the traditional sign of the cordwainer, now barely visible in the twilight. It creaks a little in the breeze. You touch it fondly as you turn back inside. The workshop now is lit only by your single candle and the last glow of twilight through the window. In this gentle lighting, the space looks homely and calm. The rows of wooden lost on their shelf cast rounded shadows. Your tools are all in their places, silhouetted in quiet readiness for another day. A cat, not the one in the painting, but your own Tabby, slips in through a cracked window, as she often does at this hour, and curls up on a scrap of wool in the corner. You chuckle, knowing she's as good as any apprentice at keeping mice away from your leather. You give her a gentle stroke and she purrs, content to share the warmth of the workshop a bit longer. Before leaving for the night, you perform one last act of ritual. Taking a small tin of cod oil, you rub it into your hands and along the seams of your own boots. This keeps the leather supple and water resistant. Your fingers, though rough and cracked, benefit from the oil too. The aches of the day's stitching ebb slightly with the brief massage. By the soft candle glow, you look around once more, mentally ticking off everything. Work finished, check. Tools cleaned, check. Orders noted, 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 check. Orders noted. It's a satisfying sight. The little world of your workshop is in order and at peace. You carry the candle toward the narrow stairs at the back that lead up to your living quarters. But before you ascend, you pause and glance back at the workshop, the hearth, the bench, the lingering scent of leather and wax. In the quiet dusk, the place almost feels sacred, like a small chapel of craft. You recall a line from an old toast your guild brothers recite on St. Crispin's Day. May our work be steady and our leather true, and may all our customers walk happily in our shoes. A faint smile comes to your lips. You gently whisper goodnight to your workshop, knowing that in the morning you'll greet it again with renewed energy. Climbing the stairs, you leave behind the day's labors. Below, the darkness deepens, broken only by the faint red pinpoint of an ember under the ash and the silver moonlight now filtering in. The tools hang silently. The new shoes rest on the shelf with a soft sheen awaiting their owner, and the old tabby cat snoozes in contented stillness. The village soundscape has hushed. Distant dogs bark once and fall silent, and a night watchman's bell is heard far off marking the hour. In the shoemaker's shop, all is tidied and quiet. The sense of industry that filled it by day has gently evaporated, replaced by a tranquil hush. As the workshop settles into night, you are upstairs enjoying a warm meal with your family, the day's toil giving way to simple comfort. Tomorrow, with sunrise, you will descend those creaking steps again, kindle the fire, and resume the ancient and gentle art of shoemaking. But for now, the tools rest and the leather sleeps. In the cozy darkness of the 18th century evening, the little shop remains, a humble sanctuary of craft awaiting a new day's light, peaceful, familiar, and well-earned. And so, with the workshop all in order and the village settling down, the shoemaker's day draws to a close, the quiet night offering rest to you and to the well-worn hands that will craft again come morning.